This is to say nothing of intention, but to put that much thought into a desired result.
Yeah.
That's not magic, that's product. And I have no problem with product, but there's a difference.
Yeah.
You know? I'm a little more interested in spell.
Like a curse
Welcome back to Fresh Off the Spaceship. I'm Larry Mizell Jr., DJ, writer here at KEXP, and your guide in this podcast. Through each episode, we're delving into the story of the Black Constellation, the artist collective that's transmitted revolutionary sounds, sights, and ideas through space and time. On this episode, we're examining the artistry and story of Maikoiyo Alley-Barnes, filmmaker, writer, designer, founding member of the Black Constellation. Now, unlike what you've heard previously on this podcast, we're going to be playing extended, edited portions of conversations between Maikoiyo and myself. But don't worry, my co-host Martin Douglas is going to join us again on our next episode. We've been talking about the constellation, and it's been handy to think of every member as a star in a couple of ways. But Maikoiyo Alley-Barnes and his role, both in the constellation and outside of it, in a lot of ways seems to be more akin to the force of gravity, an unseen, compelling force, putting things in motion, holding worlds and galaxies together.
I keep planets in orbit.
MAB is a multimedia artist, curator, filmmaker, writer, and designer whose work has generated context for, incubated, and depicted new realities, one of which would be the Black Constellation itself. Punctuation, the gallery which he co-founded and served as creative director from 2009 to 2012, is among other things the grounds upon which many of the members first came to know each other. It also spawned the line on the Shabazz Palaces song that named this very podcast. Maikoiyo's created space, quite literally, for transformative Black art in the city of Seattle. He's a brilliant creator, and he's also a curator par excellence of not just art, but of people and life. He's created in close collaboration with his comrades, whether crafting the song titles of Shabazz Palaces' seminal album Black Up, directing music videos and short films for Shabazz, THEESatisfaction, and Porter Ray. He's been recognized locally, winning Cornish College's Nettie Award, and his work has been shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Museum of National History in New York, in addition to the Frye Art Museum here in Seattle, where he curated a series of exhibitions in collaboration with several members of the Constellation, which have stood as some of the most significant events of the last decade in the arts cultural landscape of this city. Beyond that, he's a father of two. His own lineage points to the Constellation's theme of continuum, the child of accomplished artists and educators. His reverence for the authentic resonates in his personal style, his choice of compatriots, and his humility. He's personally faced down some of Seattle's worst aspects in his art and in his physical reality, and alchemized trauma into brilliant art. But before we get into our conversation, we thought it'd be good for you to hear from some of Maikoiyo's peers about his work, what he represents, and the man himself.
Yeah. I mean, Maikoiyo, he's a very unique dude.
That's Ishmael Butler, of course.
You know, his experience, his family life, his exposure and participation with like just many facets of life, you know? And then you put his like talent of observation and like his skill, you know what I mean? And then you got a very unique individual, you know? Brilliant and a visionary, really, you know? And funny. A funny dude, man. With the comedy, man, for real. Which is always, to me, a sign of, intelligence, and I can rock with that, you know? That's the bro, though, for sure.
Writer, curator, healer, Constellation family, Nagara Kudumu, has this to say about Maikoiyo.
Maikoiyo has always been a curator. And that has been the way I believe in which sort of this teaching proclivity that both of his parents had has manifested, because in every conversation that you have with Maikoiyo, whether it's you asking him for something or him asking you for something, it's a lesson that's imparted. Like really and truly, I was not at all surprised to find out that Maikoiyo has a preacher in his family, because this prophetic speech thing is a thing. And I have seen that manifest in real time.
Acclaimed filmmaker Dream Hampton looks at Maikoiyo not just as a peer, but a confidant.
Maikoiyo is one of my favorite people to complain to.
Same, big same.
Like the curmudgeonly me, he has had a lot of patience for that me or whatever. And the big same is probably connected to this too, maybe, I guess, is this like the part of us that are critics, you know?
Oh, yeah.
And the foundation of the criticism is not rooted in perfection, but rooted in a belief that things can be as good as they can be, you know? And for me, that is what Maikoiyo represents, right? Like, I guess I've known him now for like a decade, and I was always surprised at like how much he knew, like what a scholar he is. I mean, getting to know him more over the years, I know that that's his inheritance, you know, his birthright, given who his mom and his pops are, and how rooted he is in the PNW. Like, just that story for all of y'all. Like, I remember Kat or Style saying that to me about the kind of people that end up in Seattle, the kind of Black people that end up in Seattle are literally, you know, living a kind of life that they, you know, I don't want to invest too much in like rugged, like white folks, settler, pioneer narratives, but there's this, you know, there's this path that you went, you know, that you could have gone to LA, you could have stayed in LA, right? You could have stayed in Oakland, you know? And so that path to go like deeper into the woods is always like an interesting one. And it's beautiful to see what it produces. And with Maikoiyo, and Maikoiyo is also someone who'll unplug, like who you can't reach for a while. And then he'll come out with like these beautiful sculptures and masks.
He flies under the radar, but he still holds a space of very serious esteem and like a very sophisticated kind of high regard. That's
the voice of Caitlin Norris, director of the Contemporary Art Gallery, Copland Del Rio here in Seattle. She spoke to me about Maikoiyo's work.
He's been able to produce work at this very high level and somehow evade the scene, quote unquote. So in my role as the director of Copland Del Rio Gallery, I'm out and about in Chicago, New York, etc. And without really knowing him or seeing much of his work presented here in Seattle, I would see him included in major institutional exhibitions. And I was always kind of not shocked, I was, you know, lovely to see his work, but surprised that he was kind of existing in this space outside of the institutional construct, right? When I got to meet him in person, I did tell him that he had ruined Seattle arts for me, like the entire cultural landscape, because he set the bar so high with the show that he curated of Noah Davis and Khalil Joseph called Youngblood at the Frye. That was the first show that I saw after moving to Seattle. It's still the best show that I've ever seen in Seattle since moving here, and it's one of the best shows I've ever, one of the best exhibitions I've ever experienced.
One of Maikoiyo's best and oldest friends is the dynamic entrepreneur, label head, marketing executive, Jeff Gillis. Jeff describes Maikoiyo as
a prolific connector. He's a radar. I'd say he's a sonar. You know, he's prolific in the fact that he knows about things before anybody else does. I'm not sure how, because he doesn't necessarily spend tremendous time, a lot of time plugged into the matrix, but he has a tremendous radar and a tremendous ear. He's always been ahead of the game when it comes to style, when it comes to culture in general, understanding what moves, what shakes, and where to not be and how to not vibe in that same direction, how to stand out amongst a bunch of people who always stand out. I think That's kind of what it's been our whole lives, is like figuring out without really even having to overthink it, you know? When everybody was going right, he was definitely going left.
Maikoiyo's got a way of making a way through which he and his people can find new destinations.
We speak about the future, Black future in general, about what's next. And I think that the concept and understanding that we all were around a bunch of Black futurists in a way that needed to kind of come together and create something that was a little bit more unified in a way. I think, especially being here in Seattle, we all know how separated things can be, how isolated things can get. People work really good, but they also work really separate. So I think, you know, the concept of bringing together people's strengths to be able to provide a context for what we were doing, and really just trying to tell a story and not let the people who control the media here in Seattle tell the story for us.
That said, we thought it best to let MAB tell his story in his own words. Thanks for joining us. You should get some more background about yourself.
What do you want to know, Larry?
Man, so much. This is my opportunity. Born and raised in Seattle.
This is true.
Mm-hmm.
Group Health Hospital.
Okay.
Got brought home to Pike Street in the Central District.
Okay.
It's called Madrona, which at the time was a decidedly more Black and decidedly more diverse neighborhood, both economically and racially.
I guess more background on your background. You, an artist, and we're going to get into that and your background in that.
Sure.
The offspring of two artists.
Yes. My parents, my mother and father, Curtis R. Barnes and Royal Alley-Barnes, were educators, taught on the university level at the University of Washington, met there, and then were involved in education at the high school level too at Garfield, and were really also very involved in what I think is more appropriately referred to as, you know, the movement for Black sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And I think that they, you know, thought of all those things as these kind of interwoven realities, not these disparate things. So, you know, visual art as very direct and coded messaging as well was a huge part of the kind of ethos that they were a part of and were steeped in. You know, people talk about the Black House and the Panther Party, both of, you know, are realities that my parents were very intricately involved in from their inception here.
The Black House.
Yep.
What is that?
It was a house that was literally painted black in the Central District. That was the hub of a lot of, I guess it's necessary to refer to it as being counter-oppressive, but the reality of all these things is really about internalizing a more holistic and realistic view of who we are.
Self-determination.
Self-determination.
You know, that's something I understood to some degree, but it was in my association with you, with Ish, with everybody that I came to really understand it, not as so much as a reactive, damn the white man, centering that.
Well, I think that's, you know, one of the great rubs of white supremacy is this notion that everything is centered from that point and then moves out like some set of spokes from there.
Right.
Those of us who were able to grow up with a certain degree of knowledge of self being, you know, integral, and knowledge of forebears being integral to our upbringing don't come from a place of fear or awe, which can be off-putting to those who do, be they white, Black, Asian, what have you. There is almost definitely a philosophical difference, but almost a dialectic difference that you can pick up on when you're speaking to someone who comes from that kind of an upbringing. Mm-hmm. And it's not exclusively generational or regional, but I think that there are places that had hubs of that kind of thought. Mm-hmm. And there's places where that was quelched quite effectively in mass. And there are places where that have remained strongholds and that pushed on from that.
In the very heart of Seattle's Central District, Next to Garfield High School, across from Mizell's Chicken, stands the Medgar Evers Pool, the public pool named for the civil rights leader slain in 1963. In 1972, Maikoiyo's parents, Curtis Barnes and Royal Alley-Barnes, completed the Omowale mural, named for the Yoruba word that translates to "the child returns home." It stood at the pool entrance for over 2 decades, a visual representation of the African diaspora in the heart of Seattle's historic Black neighborhood. I know I saw it the very first time I ever came to the CD, lingering near the entrance of the brutalist concrete bunker that houses the pool. The Omowale mural was torn down in 1995 against the protests of the community and at the behest, perhaps, of the real estate developers who would subsequently drastically reshape the neighborhood. Today, looking online, you can't even find a picture of the mural. For me, there couldn't be a clearer exemplar of the erasure that seems to be second nature to this city.
It was right in front of Medgar Evers Pool, and it was 75 feet by 15 feet, 2 panels, painted in what would, I think on an art historical level, be referred to as more of the tradition of the Mexican muralist, as opposed to how most murals you might see now, which are more kind of the stencil kinds of process, a projection and a stencil, and it's it's a layer of paint, and you stay within the lines and you get an image. Whereas this is something that was handled in, a multi-layered, hyper-painterly approach. But I think that what's under-considered is how the project was funded and what it spawned. Because the 1% for Art program that exists throughout the United States, which is how a great number of things are funded at this point in time, it found its roots in that project.
Really?
So it's always interesting when you listen to certain narratives around contributions made or how a thing, how things came to be. But there was not a notion that city governments or state governments had any obligation to fund public art, or that taxes that we paid into these systems should be coming back for notions of beautification within our spaces. But the Omowale mural, which was, I dare say, an ode to our sovereignty, ode to what we had endured in, what would be considered the wilderness of North America, and also a notion of what our future would look like, stood in the middle of the central, literally, one could argue in the dead center of the central district for 20 plus years, until it was torn down without consulting the neighborhood or the community, illegally, actually.
The city do that?
The city did that. Oddly enough, the Parks Department did that.
Odd because?
Odd because at the time, my mother was working for the Parks Department.
Mm-hmm. So that happened in the...
I believe that was 94.
Yeah. Because I think I laid eyes on it.
Yeah, and it had fallen into a degree of disrepair, but it, technically the nature of the contract is one that the city did not own it. Mm-hmm. So you should theoretically have to contact the artists about that, but there should have to have been any number of other things in regards to what the community wanted.
Yeah.
To do with the large public work that was sitting there.
This to me stands out as like one keynote example of the engine of erasure that seems to exist here.
I like alliteration.
Yeah, a big fan.
Yeah, the engine of erasure. Mm-hmm. I like that one, Larry. I think it's very apropos. I think I've referred to it as a penchant for revision. But I think that the activity that and the energy that goes behind an engine is perhaps more accurate, because it is very active, yeah? Mm-hmm. And I think very necessary to continue to tell falsehoods, right? Like if there is artifact and remnants, then that starts to beget questions, right? And we've had a terrible history of that in this city, architecturally, definitely in narratives. I wonder if that's not something that's much deeper and embedded into some, more ancient curse or something.
Yeah.
Gentrification is in a lot of ways, an oversimplification of the level of, or the degree of machination that goes into this end result where your neighborhood looks nothing like you remember it growing up.
Right.
But on a spiritual level, I think that, that work of art was a talisman and a welcome and also a repellent to certain energies. And that has nothing to do with race or color or creed. So, when the mural was being painted, you had, shamans coming and energy workers and sorceresses coming and praying over it, blessing it. You also had artists from all over the world who made, pilgrimage to come and see it because, again, 75 by 15 is not small.
No.
And if you understand it on a technical level, on a technological level, on a spiritual level, on a art historical level, something like that not being preserved or recognized in a certain way, or the progenitors of it not being acknowledged in a certain way, is consistent with that engine of erasure that you're talking about.
And of course, that's not the end of the story of works generated by your parents.
Oh, gosh, no. The hyper-prolific workers in various mediums, but also people who I think really contributed even more when we start talking about the medium of the human spirit and people. And, my mother was an arts educator and still is an arts educator into her near 80s. My father is now passed. I think transitioned a lot of that energy into helping people who were coming through an organization called the Conservation Corps. And a lot of people who were considered unemployable, having, in a lot of cases, very recently transitioning out of incarceration, teaching them skills. And he was very instrumental in those skills being more than just physical labor.
Right.
And there was a great level of pushback because Conservation Corps was basically who the City Corps of Engineers and the Parks Department just used to do all of the grunt work, which is fine. But
my brother worked for the California Conservation Corps, which, they're like volunteer firefighter people.
Right. So again, go do, the either really backbreaking or really dangerous work for X amount of dollars. And, but teaching people about notions around entrepreneurship or notions around higher skills on a technological level was not part of the environment that he walked into. So that was a huge portion of his legacy in his passing. But if you want to talk about, painting and sculpting and working in textiles and all that stuff, both of them are gifted, to say the least.
Definitely recognized. Yeah. And how was that transmitted to you? And how does it come through your practice?
I mean, I was immersed in it, whatever genetic dispositions aside. And again, that's I guess, potentially a crapshoot.
We've seen that.
Yeah, sure. I don't think that I can hold a candle to either of them if you want to talk about output or what they've done in a human-to-human interaction level. But I think that, being immersed in the ways that I was and apprenticing within their studio spaces, but also being exposed to their peers or the artists who mentored them in very kind of intimate ways is something that I took for granted for a very long time because it just was my everyday.
Yeah.
And it is a type of privilege that I think, and you can call it birthright, but I would consider it a privilege. being immersed, there's no substitute, I think, for that in regards to the possibilities that are available in that space. But that said, I think that, we don't live in a city that there is a great level of commerce or remuneration around that as a skill set. So in both their cases, they worked, classic 9-to-5s, even though they were world renowned for doing what they did, and do. And I don't necessarily, I've never been taught to think that your supposed brilliance at your artistic output is necessarily incongruent with having to do other things to make sure that ends meet.
It just seems like maybe in other places it finds commensurate remuneration.
Maybe more often. I think, the notion that, we live in a period of time where I think we see more people living as artists.
Certainly.
But I don't think that even within that, you're talking about a large percentage of those who actually make art, even though it becomes more and more popular and people refer to themselves very loosely as artists, the great portion of artists and the great number of artists make and aren't necessarily ever recognized or remunerated for that, or perhaps in some cases even care to be.
Right.
So I think, there are some degrees of assumed compensation that aren't necessarily consistent with what it is that we're actually here to do. And I think that has been skewed by capitalism and any number of other things. But, art for art's sake is a very Western notion, right? Design for designs, for the sake of visual consumption as opposed to its usefulness is very new. So I think, I know for a fact that if my parents were living in other environments where art consumption worked in a different way and the politics around art were different, that they would have probably had a different set of paths. But I think that there is a self-gazing that comes from that would have perhaps not availed them to share a lot of who they were with the innumerable people that they ended up sharing it with.
Right. That human-to-human work you're talking about.
Yeah. You think about these alternate realities where a person might have taken another path or, got on X plane or X train and, set out in a different way. But I think about, locusts. I think about different kinds of gestation periods. I think about, like you make a work, you may never be acknowledged for it or understand who it's affected, I think personally it's been a not a place of solace, but it's been a thing that I have to keep reminding myself about, because I don't think that there is always a 1-to-1 or 1-to-10 relationship as far as your understanding of what comes back to you.
Right.
Or even a compact enough timeline for you, assuming you live, however long, will ever necessarily get that direct feedback from whoever ends up consuming it with their eyes and hearts and minds, right?
With that moonlight on your mind, you wonder what you'll find. With the sunlight falling down, you got to find a sound. With that starlight in your eyes, you wanna find surprise. With the neon in your blood, you move to find your love tonight. Yeah, tonight.
Pike Street is the main artery of activity on Seattle's Capitol Hill. At the end of the 2000s, a new space opened up on Pike Street that created new possibilities.
Punctuation was a seed. Two acquaintances at the time had a space on Capitol Hill called Laced Up. And Laced Up, I think, was really important and under-recognized for its contribution to it's always strange to refer to consumption as culture, but but to culture. At some point in time, around 2008, 2009, there was a necessity for them to pivot in the manner of how they were conducting business. And a lot of my experience at the point in time was in curation and in brand consulting. Mm-hmm. I was asked whether or not I'd be interested in helping with a rebrand of that space. And there was a series of pivots that were necessary inside of the pivots. So what was initially going to be a rebrand of a retail space needed to become something that was a little bit more nebulous, that continued the embracing of community and people feeling welcome within a space, whether they were spending money or they just needed to sit down and shoot the shit. Punctuation, I think, turned into a gallery space and salon that we referred to as a mixed-use space. Mm-hmm. But I think the thing that was noteworthy at the time was a physical space where visual art being made by people of color and women who had not garnered the attention of traditional galleries in Seattle, in a lot of cases elsewhere, where, you know, people who 6 months previous would have been standing online for a sneaker drop were now investing in their first piece of visual art. Mm-hmm. You know, I remember that quite often a question would be, you know, somebody would open the door and be like, "Can I come in?" Like, why not? And you're like, "Well, I don't have any money to spend." And you're like, "Well, why would that be the necessity?" You know, like the, for lack of a better term, the price of entry. Right. You know, but you came to realize at the time, or I came to realize at the time, just how unwelcoming. And I guess I'd always known that, how unwelcoming the notions around the classic white cube, had been. And how rarely, and especially in a city that was becoming progressively whiter, in a neighborhood that was becoming
more cube,
even more disengaged with its youth and the various peoples who had occupied it for quite some time. It was a space where many of those people came and were able to discuss things like design and art and fashion and love lives and any number of other things. Mm-hmm. And it was done, I think it happened, again, quite organically. You know, it's like anything else, you know, you're so close to a thing that you don't necessarily reconcile its impact because you're busy making sure that the lights stay on.
Right. But
it was ran collectively. And I think it's necessary to point out J.C. Coleman and Keisha Davidson and Blanca Martinez and Cody Perez and Mnet Desalon and J. Maxwell Bennett. I mean, there's so many people that were involved in the situation who've gone off and had, you know, their own impactful careers and lives in these various other capacities, in education and in art and in fashion and in, Intisar Ali. I mean, there's a lot of people that, again, they may mean nothing to those listening or may mean everything to somebody listening if they've actually interacted with those people. But I think the things that I'm proud of are that, you know, we showed Hebrew Brantley early. We showed Kat Larson early. We showed Stacey Rosich early. You know, we showed Mike Watkins early, Mike Wagner early. And I think that, you know, also having shows and exhibitions, but shows I think is a little more accurate in that scale, and events where people felt welcome and were able to interact on a very, there wasn't this upward gazing notion around the makers, you know, and they were fun.
Yes.
And, you know, we would have DJs and, you know, and it is the place that, you know, Ishmael Butler meets Stasia Irons and Catherine Harris White. And it is the place that, Otis Calvin DJs, this event for this thing. And it is the place where, so there's all these other stories that kind of generate out of there.
Porter Ray Sullivan,
who was intimately involved in working at Laced Up, who was this, unbeknownst to a lot of people, this, he's a visual artist as well. But, that kid helped hang nearly every show. And he's not a kid, he's a grown man now. But, at the time, Thaddeus, and there's a bunch of people I can think of who were, in and around the space in different ways and would just stop through because of either their connection to what had happened, was happening there previously, being curious about what this new thing was, or, and they were coming in and being like, what is this? There's Black people running a gallery. You know what I mean? There's, it was a space that, was curated somewhere in the region of, I think it was 20 some odd shows in 3 years. And I do enjoy the fact that, now, however many years later, people will come up to me and be like, oh man, it was the first time I ever did X, Y, and Z, or it was I had never seen this, I remember now. And it should also be said, Ishmael Butler, Tilson, they invested time, money. They believed in this vision that, was brought forth, and then continued to contribute to that as well.
One thing, clear some space out so we can space out. Clear some space out so we can space out. Clear some space out so we can space out. Clear some space out so we can space out.
So music was very integral to this, and thinking about these things is not these disparate kinds of, so when we referred to it as a mixed use space, it wasn't, just another event space. And that's no knock on any of these subsequent places that also, frankly, very directly generated by 1 degree of separation from punctuation. It is the field of dreams notion there, but it's also a crapshoot. You might build it and maybe nobody shows up. In this case, we built it and there were 500 people there the first time we did an opening, and then there was, we would have, our openings would have people spilling all up and down Pike Street. Yeah. Because we start talking about the Black Constellation, it's, I was to answer it in a succinct way, I'd say it's, it's the birthplace of that energy, or at least the space that energy was codified.
Fresh off the spaceship, dipped in punctuation.
That is a line from us all.
That's a line.
Can't tell 'em. New off the spaceship, dipped in punctuation.
Punctuation was a space outside of the sphere of the art scene as it was known, a welcoming place where young people, particularly young folks of color, could hone their tastes for and be exposed to art and media they might not have encountered otherwise. It was an incubator that served as a bulwark against the age-old paradigm of Black artists having to escape Seattle in order to gain acceptance within it.
We were in a position where there was like an almost violently aggressive, hyper-male, hyper-white professional environment in the arts. And I don't think it was said as directly as that initially, but that was, what was going on. And Seattle, with its penchant for erasure and its penchant for the sublimation of the root, insert Bam Bam, insert, take your pick.
Yeah.
The number of people who've ended up having to, do you know who Reggie Watts is if he doesn't leave here? You know what I mean? Do you know who Jimmy is if he doesn't leave here?
Right.
They're not going to be any less brilliant. You know what I mean?
But they got to go.
Right. But is that always a necessity? And what can we do to create structures that have more of a foothold in the proliferation of the brilliance that comes from this place, and the narrative, control over the narratives that are necessary, and the various means that they're necessary, and the bombardment that's really necessary for that story to be out there.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what that space was about, and I think it on some levels was very effectual in doing. And I think there's a lot of people who grew from that energy. I definitely grew from that energy. I felt like it was really necessary to reach out to a cross-generational group of makers because it didn't exist in any codified way here. And I think that there's a great history of it here, but again, usually it's the Barrows telling the story about what was happening on Jackson, and
right.
God love them, but you're not of the fold, fam. You're just not.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And that happens far too often, and it turns into a operator game.
Mm-hmm.
Or isn't that right?
Telephone.
Telephone, right? Where there's this degradation of the original message, or a selective telling of the story that is hinged upon whatever ulterior motives might be on the part of the narrator, as opposed to those who are in the midst of it, recounting it real time and making bonds around that are longer lasting.
Yeah.
You know?
That's something Martin and I touched on, just kind of thinking, as Black music critics around that time,
mm-hmm.
thinking about how, well, just everywhere, but certainly here, we are spoon-fed, white critical take, POV on everything,
sure.
let alone just Black creative output.
Absolutely.
That is the default.
Yep. And obviously now that media has has flattened in certain ways and is more egalitarian, supposedly, the notion would be that improves. But unfortunately, authentic critique and critical commentary has not stayed the course of being an actual practice. You tend to get a degree of sameness, a lack of qualified opinion in the now, even though there are far more voices. And I think we were in this funny kind of sweet spot that many people were still, though not necessarily Luddites, there was still some degree of gatekeeping that was afoot. So what we were doing stood out in a way because it was en masse enough. And that said, we were quite lucky here because some of the ostensibly white journalists who would have been recounting it were actually qualified in a certain way. Mm-hmm. It's just to say that sometimes their viewpoints are just hyper myopic.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say that because if you're interviewing me, I'm probably interviewing you.
No doubt.
I want to know, what's your frame of reference? What qualifies you to even be able to speak on it outside of your curiosity? And curiosity is enough as an entry point, but it's not necessarily enough to speak qualifiedly.
It's not stripes.
No. I mean, fuck, do you even love words?
Right.
I care about that from my writers. The writers I grew up on loved words,
right.
Not just the notion of
their voice.
Matter of fact, most of them will tell you, I need to get out of my own way.
Yes, right.
With this, what might be considered the golden age of interest in contemporary Black art,
mm-hmm.
all of which I'm for. But as not unlike critique, just because there's more doesn't necessarily mean that the quality, is at some apex point per se. I think that there is brilliance afoot, but I'm for even the mediocrity. I'm for even at least on a philosophical level, I am for the opportunity for us to be able to be mediocre.
As much as anybody else.
Yes.
Right.
But I do think that there is an absence of qualified critical thought to go along with this robust, rich insurgence of Black voice and creativity.
Maikoiyo's crucial reflections on the critical atmosphere are one thing, but what about his own life as an artist?
The making has been continuous. And so we'll call it the invasion of the spaces that were created to either hoard our makings or exclude us or separate us from the things that we were supposed to communicate with, I do think we had a hand in that. And we did it in a really bold and brash way, as far as I'm concerned, a really beautiful way. Because of the lack of, well, I think this is important what you're doing, what you and Martin are doing here, is responsible critique involved connective tissue, involved research and understanding that there's these things aren't these, the singular genius, this light bulb that goes off. And all of a sudden somebody realizes, holy shit, Khalil Joseph is a genius, or holy shit, Ishmael Butler. No, man, that didn't start when, you know what I'm saying, Blowout Comb came out. Because ego and the notion of discovery is super important in the critical space, it's very rare that people want to do the necessary diligence to connect, the ties that bind. So I think that, the forays that we offered up in the aughts through the now, and as far as I'm concerned, previous to that, but actively as a collective, it was a shot in the arm, if you will,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would love to talk more about that, because what a game-changing paradigm is what came to be known as part of the body of work presented by the Constellation at the Frye Museum here. That was absolutely a sea change. The things that happened there, as much as like that first Shabazz show. To me, I would just wonder if you would speak upon kind of like those shows and how they came about.
Every once in a while, someone who's not supposed to be at a dinner party ends up at a dinner party. In the case of some of the things that happened in Seattle in contemporary art, there was this very interesting window in which a few of us people who would have been considered outsiders were being invited into spaces with people who were in decision-making positions. I was far more interested at the time in helping to solidify my father's legacy. And so when I found myself in those positions, at these tables full of museum directors from all over the world, really, but definitely the United States, I would ask this, kind of given questions like, well, who here at this table is interested in a lost master, a lost contemporary master? At the time, hyper male, hyper white, curatorial disposition or set of dispositions would be something that was contrary. 9 out of 10 times, there would be no interest expressed. But there is the 10th time. And in regards to the Frye, there was an executive director there at the time named Joanne Bernie Dansker, who, being, I think, someone who considered themselves a firebrand and someone who was a trailblazer as far as being a woman who was a curator of a certain generation, the notion of something that was authentically different and multidisciplinary was something that harkened back to what she considered kind of the golden ages of Renaissance in the previous century. So understanding that, from an art historical standpoint, these things happen, once every 100 years or so, I think she was primed to be looking for that and felt like she had found it. So that was, I want to call it a soft target, but I think that had a lot to do with why that was an option at the Frye. Other institutions in the city had the same set of opportunities. They subsequently have shown innumerable Black artists, and I commend them for that, but they're yet in many cases, and they're doing much better. I know that, but I think that Seattle, with its, call it second city kinds of unfortunate notions, defers to brilliance from outside and or the outside canonizing whatever brilliance is here, and then they will celebrate it. So the Frye, I think, at the time was looking for brilliance within what it was fancied brilliance, and in survey of things that were happening here. And I think Joanne was a factor. There is a curator by the name of Yoko Ott, who is now deceased, who's a factor in that. You know, there were people who understood that there was something buzzing. But it should be said that we had, you know, in the popular culture realm already made quite a set of statements before the institutional world was even remotely interested in what we were doing. But that said, there was risk taken, because when asked, you know, if you were given a show, what would you do? I thought, well, I could say, I would do this, this, and this. Or I could say, we would do such, such, and such. And I chose we over I, and think that's, in the case of the Frye, why that was the case. And one, it seemed like a lot more fun to do it with people who I enjoyed working with. Two, I think that it was unquestionably going to be a more robust experience with all those parties involved. It was also just really strategic, but also notions around communal sharing of spoils are important too. And it's important that, you know, younger people can see the viability of, and it's not as simple as representation, it's like, it's the viability of other options. Mm-hmm. You know, it doesn't need to be you seeing yourself. It needs to be you seeing something different, you know what I mean, than what you're used to seeing. Because that's the thing that I heard most from people, young people of color after this. I mean, because there was a series of shows at the Frye that we were involved in different capacities. But I think that what I heard was, you know, I never felt welcome in these spaces. Now, if you're into visual art, you go into museums. But if you don't think of yourself that way, it's not necessarily a space that you're going to go into. But us approaching it from a programming level that was multidisciplinary, with a degree of cool associated with it, that energy spread. I know that conversations that I had had in punctuation with Nicholas about the fact that he was interested in showing in spaces other than the spaces that were always reaching out to him resonated. I know that having conversations with Nep about wanting to get the work back out there after a certain kind of, not necessarily a production hiatus, but definitely a sharing hiatus was important. Knowing that the sensibilities of Ishmael or Stasia or Moni or Otis were something that translated well into the institutional space. At some point in time, I started to think of, you know, being a connector as an artistic practice too.
Definitely.
I think some of that is more subconscious than conscious, but I think that there's times when I've been prolific at that. Mm-hmm. There's times when I've been, you know, a hermit. But I figure if you're out there, like, you know, and you have ears, that you might as well spread the good news. Especially if you got some awesome ass news to share, you know?
It's energizing. Real quick, about that series of shows, let's just knock them down. What was first?
There was a show called Moment Magnitude, which was a survey of work being made in the first 10 years, basically, of the 2000s by artists living in and around Seattle. That was the first show. And that exhibition had work, collaborative work by myself and Stasia Irons and Catherine Harris White, and then collaborative work by myself and Ishmael Butler and Tendai Marar and collaborative work with an artist named Giuliano Miro del Valle, I believe is how their name is said. So I think that's 2012. So there's large scale video work in there, a headdress / some jewelry, and a couple of headdresses in that exhibition. Subsequent to that, there's a show called Your Feast Is Ended, and another show called The Unicorn Incorporated, which were mounted simultaneously. The Unicorn Incorporated was a retrospective of my father's work, and Your Feast Is Ended, which was an abbreviated title that was the longer form being, O Ye Parasites, Your Feast Is Ended, a title which was considered too aggressive and potentially off-putting to and this is not my quote, this is one of the curator's quotes, the white museum-going masses.
Because they're parasites. We don't want to offend any parasites.
Again, this is what I'm saying.
We want parasites to come in too.
My statement was open-ended. It wasn't directed towards anyone other than parasites.
Hit dog on a holler, right?
But hey, that's how the individual in question felt. He can remain nameless, but you guys can do your research. Not a bad guy, just he sees things how he sees things. But that said, so that exhibition was a 3-person show with Nep Sidhu and Nicholas Galanin and myself. And let's see here. And again, in each of those cases, there was a lot of public programming, and it was important to us that the programming was not designed by an external entity, and that it was in lockstep with what the messaging of the exhibition was, which caused a lot of upheaval in the institution, actually, like pretty major upheaval in the institution, which, again, blessing and curse. Subsequently in, 2016, 16, was an exhibition called Young Blood that was the first museum-based exhibition, definitely outside of LA, but technically period, of the works of the brothers Noah Davis and Khalil Joseph. Technically, they had shown together at the Underground Museum, but in a classic institutional space, it was the first exhibition thereof, and I curated that exhibition. So, I mean, I think that's the immediate. So there was, 4 exhibitions over, 4 to 5 years, which is actually a pretty high frequency for one, group of people.
As our conversation continued, Maikoiyo brought up a few topics that are frequently discussed amongst the BC. Notions of authenticity and attribution, and of course, continuum. We'll get to that right after a short break.
So, it's interesting because I think I have this conversation. I know that Ishmael and I have this conversation. I know that you and I have this conversation. I know that myself and everybody who I consider part of this thing that we do have this conversation about whether or not there is the reverence for the authentic anymore. But I don't think that it's ever going to be popularized or promoted if it is happening in mass. You know what I mean? Like, I think that that's the trap that we kind of fall into, is this notion that acknowledgement by some external force or financial remuneration is the measure by which we can garner the success of a movement, energy. And I battle with that personally. I am not someone who is unaffected by that phenomena. But, when you ask me what it was, we talk about support, that's where one of the things I love about us is that whether we do it directly or indirectly, there is a reminder regularly of that. there are a lot of notions around what America has ever contributed to the world. And I've maintained for quite some time, publicly and privately, that the only thing, because I don't actually believe that jazz music can be attributed to the Americas. I think it's resultant of the continent. Don't think rock and roll can be attributed to the Americas as a result thereof. So you understand what I'm saying? Like there's no, the blues, like all those things are very...
Because that's the answer. A lot of ethnomusicologists, a lot of people. Jazz music. We wouldn't,
Right, but I think that's frankly a very Western notion that likes to compartmentalize as opposed to thinking about things in a continuum.
There it is.
But there is an American invention and contribution. And the cult and culture of, and I'll put kind of a caveat if I was writing it, I'd put it in a parenthetic, universal celebrity. This notion that we need, desire, or should have recognition in mass. I think that's very American. And not to say that it has not proliferated via all these different mechanisms that we have for the proliferation of it. And I tie it very closely to, ironically, something that I love very much, which is, the means of dissemination that is cinema and the moving image. But, and some people would say, well, would you narrow that down to social media? And I'd say yes, but that started previous to that, and misinformation and propaganda and all those things, they're ancient, I'm sure. But the amplification of it to the degree that we're at now, I think is something that is very much resultant of a cultural society that has needed to function on that thing you coined earlier, the engine of erasure. Warhol's notion of the 15 minutes of fame. The notion that things, integrity, authenticity, are spaces where we would sacrifice for the sake of acknowledgement, I think is a very new and very American thing. So when you ask me, is it something that's fallen out of favor in a certain way? I think that there are people who understand the same thing that I understand in that regard. And I don't think that there's just a few of us, but are we going to use the same mechanisms to relay that, that those who are engaged in the other side of it would? So
right.
The
You're
notion...
talk to your front-facing camera on social media and explain it?
Again, nearly everything that is done on a regular circa 2021 would have been something that would have caused nearly everyone around you to worry about your mental, spiritual integrity 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean that it is inherently wrong per se, but it might be something that we want to examine a little bit. Yeah,
that's real.
Like anything else, there is room for alchemy within that. And I think, one of the things that I know was discussed and has been a tenet of what we have done, both overtly and inadvertently, is the notion of using mechanisms that weren't necessarily designed for our freedom. Here are you and I speaking and thinking in English. We morph these things and still use them for our benefit. How do you do that without sacrificing X amount of your spirit is the dance, right? Because I think it's safe to say, I think many people will concede now that overexposure to most of these things, these mediums, can be maddening.
The word you've mentioned a couple times is a word I expect will pop up. Continuum. What does that mean to you? Especially in regards to the works, the associations of the constellation.
I think that more than anything else is it involves a removal of self to varying degrees of success. Because I think you have to acknowledge, if you are genuinely talking about being part of any continuum, that you are part of a confluence, right? There is this amorphous notion around energy and that you are a vessel at very best, to varying degrees of success, both in your ability to carry whatever said liquid is and distribute it, and be able to receive it. You know, if one was to imagine a vessel that had openings on either end, could receive and pour at once, and could expand indefinitely, but also, weirdly enough, didn't have a border of its own, so it could blend seamlessly. So maybe single cellular or smaller, you know what I mean, amoebas or something are a better example of, you know, things that can
like a
share a cellular wall, or like a witch,
like a river.
A river. Yes, I mean, water is the, you know, it is the, you know, a river is a good thing because, again, like, is it actually, where are the points of containment? You know, they're not, right? Because there's stuff seeping into the beds, and it's constantly, you know, morphing and changing. So I think those are the things that come to mind when I think about continuum. But as one who doesn't really think of time functioning forward to back, it's kind of difficult to think about it as this thing that's the past and the future aligning and having this, you know. But I think that for those who think of time that way, then I think it's this acknowledgement of the fact that you are part of a through line, a point of intersection at best. And whereas energy can't be stopped, I guess it could be redirected, or it could be held on to in a manner that, you know, usually is pretty unhealthy. I think continuum is, if anything, antithetical to many of the other things that we hold dear, whether that's the hoarding of information, attempts to capitalize upon said hoarding, and distributing it as we see fit. It absolutely is the acknowledgement of the fact that this energy comes from someplace. I'm not going to necessarily say before you, but it comes from someplace. To be effective in any way, as far as I see it in a continuum, like, notions of self have to start to be removed. It's a term that I started using curatorially in response to a point, because in my own artistic work, I kept running into the notions around futurism. And people framing my work accordingly. And whereas I understand it from a art historical standpoint, it denotes these very staunch lines about where a thing starts and stops. And I think art history in the Western lens needs that, because you need to be able to identify where a thing began, which
on that kind of timeline you were talking about,
which is just absurdist. And usually some outsiders, you know, later stage attempt, again, contradicting myself. But yes, if we were talking about this linear notion, someone who's usually disconnected, whether it's revision or just made up. You know, which are honestly two different things. Because revision denotes you know the truth and then you're doing something different. I think so often when we start talking about anthropological notions, we're talking about people just making shit up. Oh, they did this because of this, and this is when they started this. And it's like, well, just knowing what we know about natural disasters, there can be a whole missing chunk of the necessary piece, or you don't speak the language well enough or understand the intricacies of the language to understand this nuance. So you misinterpreted this when you know what I mean? And then, so notions around futurism, and I mean this other than a coined movement in art at a particular point in time, are usually pretty misnomeric, because they denote that everybody's functioning under the same timeline, has the same experience of time, that there has not been movements that have, again, along this timeline proceeded, that didn't examine many of these same notions. And also, it engages all these notions around fantasy that aren't necessarily a part of the dynamic. And in many of the cases, centers whiteness in a way that is a lie. And I'm, per my upbringing, as I was discussing really early, that's not the way I was taught to think, and not the way that I've embraced thinking outside of those teachings. I think of time as more of a confluence of things that are moving in various directions. And so when I think of a continuum, it's the closest thing to, as you put it, water that I think you can frame in regards to time. The me-centric nature of the Western world, however many last several thousands of years, has a lot to do with me first, or I discovered, or attribution, right? And I think the continuum, if we're talking about it in its purest form, removes attribution. And I know that attribution is really important for people for a lot of reasons, but if the work is actually the point, then
Right.
how important is attribution?
Yeah. The impact of it.
You're componential,
Sure.
but I would argue that a lot of those messages would have, they probably came to multiple individuals at the same time. Who was able to realize them in a fashion that they were spread out in the way they needed to be? Who's to say? You hear people talk about being, I'm the influencer's influencer, I'm the, you know what I mean? That's a, you know what I mean? Like skewing, how gross we might consider the notion of being an influencer as we put it in the now, or the plug as we put it in the now. Like there's an authenticity to that.
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
energy came from someplace. Acknowledgement is important if we're thinking of it as part of some grander spell, but not for the sake of deification or idolatry, which is, I think, what it often becomes in the now. And I think the continuum removes potentially, you're thinking of things in notion of continuum, helps offset the kind of idolatrous notions we have around attribution in the now.
What Ish calls me mania.
It's a good one. It's more alliteration. It's nice to hang out with people who like words.
It's a beautiful thing.
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah, there is things come from a place and a time and from people and everything. But yeah, if it's used to glorify oneself, it just kind of rings hollow, because it didn't come from within your body.
Well, not to contradict, but I don't know if they come from a place or a time. They come from the ephemera and may be codified in a way that we can understand them in a given place or a time, or in a particular way in a given place or a time. And I think that is important for our post-experiential understanding of the thing. But when people just say, they say, you had to be there.
Right.
That's probably actually true for nearly everything. Because even the recording of a thing is very different than, because again, we're sitting here and we're talking, right? And people are going to hear this and they're going to have whatever. Maybe it gets chopped up, maybe it's uninterrupted, but your facial expressions are lost in the moment. I think if you were even to break down what epiphany breaks down to on some Latin level, it would probably literally mean, message delivered.
Right.
From where? Who's to say? Perhaps there's some deification or something. I don't know.
But that's the thing. That person isn't like, I came up with this message for everybody. It's from on high.
I received it.
Yes. That's the whole thing. It's not about me, even though a lot of times it ends up being about them, et cetera, whether that's by their design or their folks. And that's something I've noted through the practice of everybody that's a part of this thing. When I see them doing their dance, whatever it is, I see them receiving. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't feel like, not to say that there's not some great degree of thought, practice, premeditation that's a part of the delivery, but everybody seems very open to that receiving and is similarly generous in the creation. And that's the biggest through line I ever see. Besides a million other things, family histories, stuff like that.
Sure. But I think that's and again, when you said that you wanted to talk about this, I was kind of like, oh, I'm too close to this to talk about this in a certain way. And I still maintain that. My perspective is the perspective that comes from, a certain degree of proximity, and not the same one that someone else with, again, same proximity would have. But I think that there is an acknowledgement across the board that there is the ability to get out of the way of me when the work's afoot. And there has to be a lot of focus on the notion of oneself in preparation for receiving said messages, in keeping oneself safe enough to even be around to receive said messages. It's a undertaking. But I think that there is, because if we were to be also frank, there are people who have been in certain proximity and aren't anymore.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times, if I was to have to point out anything, and this isn't, many of those people are listening, they feel a way, find me.
Pull up.
You're welcome to. Yeah. But I think that, the me started to become the imperative. And whether or not that's other people telling you that, you need to pay more, and perhaps I'm a fool because of that, and I do believe in the notion of bodies of work as opposed to explosive, phenomenal impact. I do believe in durational, mantric practice. And not to say that I always am, if I was being absolutely candid, I feel farther away from that right now than I have in quite some time. But whether or not my Father is still speaking to me directly or not, I always hear is that, you're always in the studio. Whether there's a codified object or not, and he imparted that to me when I had my daughter who's now 22 years old, about to be. I was at home with her and I wasn't able to go into my studio. And at the time, my practice was oil painting. And it was, I was like, how am I going to oil paint with this baby attached to my chest? And, and I could go, in the studio at night, but I would want to make things all the time. And I remember saying to him, I just don't feel as connected to my practice because I can't just be in the studio whenever I want to now. And he was like, dude, you're always in the studio, And I remember being like, you're tripping. But he was right, because I think that though one may turn the codification of an item, of an object on and off, and there are people who have, learned to be very, regimented about output, I think that's a very kind of commerce-driven notion as opposed to how it actually works. Because, something that you saw and have forgotten seeing, on a conscious level 25 years ago may inform the thing you make tomorrow, And I think that can be something that's a little lost on us sometimes.
We talked about this before, and, the idea of like what the mood board has kind of done to a lot of people's aesthetic. You feel like your work and the work of your contemporaries within the constellation has been on the mood board for a lot of things.
Well, I know for a fact that that's been the case. It's been, told to me by younger stylists, people who had no idea that I had anything to do with making given thing or what my role of it might have been. So I guess maybe I didn't speak to the fact that I've also done art direction and costuming for other filmmakers and other people of whatever note that, have reached whatever ascendancy. And filmmaking is interesting on whatever scale because it's usually collaborative. And so there is a crew of people. And so often people think of a thing as a given person's aesthetic, but generally it's resultant of, some set of conversations and mutual agreed upon aesthetic ethos, So the singular genius notion is a decidedly white patriarchal reality. None of these things happen in this vacuum, you know? Like, I don't care what we're talking about. If we're talking about the 1920s and, you know, what happened in Paris, like, for all the people you know about, like, there's a confluence of realities. And quite frankly, the person who probably had the most influence on it is not somebody whose name is going to ring any bells. I think we've talked about at times the, you know, eschewing of attribution, but for a very long time I was far more interested in, and still am, to, you know, whatever the end product is. But you come to realize that there are people who are outside of the fold who, and when I say feed off it, I mean this in the most generative and positive sense of the words, feed off of these things. When you're 13 and you see a bunch of brown-skinned Black women walking through the wilderness on somebody's Twitter or whatever, you know what I mean? What Tumblr. Yeah. Right. It impacts you probably differently than it impacts you at 25, and you might internalize it, you know? So any ownership or a notion of originality that you, or origin that you feel like you have, is frankly usually erroneous in the first place. But also, why in the world did you even put it the fuck out?
Right.
Like, why did you share it if it weren't for it to grow beyond the point that, you know, it left it, you know? I think that we've really effectively had a hand in, along with others, a hand in spreading a notion of a vein of Black aesthetic that is, at this point in time, its own kind of visual language. There is a notion that seeing a Black body moving through space in some joyous or naturalistic or mysterious, for the sake of just our, you know, our lack of resolve, as a given in the now. Plenty of companies for quite some time, but especially post the, you know, most recent set of movements for Black sovereignty and safety, have kind of appropriated for the sake of sales. I think one of my roles in this is as historian in a way, because I have a very clear memory about trying to tell people about why some of these things were important and getting pushback because it didn't sound like whatever else was being made, or didn't look like whatever else was being made, or wasn't being put through the measures of what was already popular. This is happening all the time. Right. Been uninterrupted. And that's why I prefer the term continuum. And again, it's another term that in my art practice, I didn't see as much, but I see it all the time now. And I'm glad that I see it all the time because I think it's more apropos. Can I take any credit for it? No, it's words existed for, you know, for quite some time. But I think it's like anything else. I've tried to be, since I became conscious of it, tried to be adamant about is that these are spells, you know, they're visual spells, and they're, you know, there is incanting and energy and ritual that is involved in all of them. And a blood price, frankly, to all of them. And every spell don't actually go the way you want either. So, you know, some of the oversaturation, some of the desensitization that comes from that oversaturation is also
part of the price,
you know? But also, in my case, the price may have been a lack of the ability to capitalize upon it in a certain way because it just wasn't my focus. And again, this is to say nothing of intention, but to put that much thought into a desired result, that's not magic, that's product. And I have no problem with product, but there's a difference. I'm a little more interested in spell.
How did you get hip?
Way more interested in spell.
How did you get to an understanding of that spiritual dimension of the practice?
That's a good question. An examination of where an idea comes from probably has something to do with that. Like, you know, this esoteric notion of like, well, where the fuck did that come from? do I know how to do this thing that I never learned how to do? Why was this thing effective in the way that it was? You know what I mean? Like, so I guess to some degree there was some intellectualization about how a thing worked that helped to shine a light on that. I also think that interactions with people who I'm adamant that I've known before, who in almost serendipitous ways that, you know, weirdly enough, things like technology have helped confirm the simultaneous impetus of thought. It's amazing sometimes what a group text can do.
Yeah.
For the affirmation of the spiritual. But I think finding your peers, but also all of that kind of unspoken that starts to, you know, happen with a certain level of frequency when you do find your people and your tribe has had something to do with it. Having children, in my case, had a lot to do with that. It's a litany of, you know, grocery list of things I would say if I was to be forced to, but it's also like, if I'm being super honest, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And it continues.
Every day.
We're live on location right now at Punctuation, downtown Seattle, Washington. It's a wonderful group of people here. For those of you that don't know, the purpose for this event is to showcase some of the art. Maikoiyo Alley-Barnes was a victim of a brutal beating in downtown Seattle, Washington in April of 2005. Now he's come back strong. The city is behind him. And what does this moment mean for you right now?
What does this moment mean for me? This moment is a celebration of the alchemic and healing power of art, and like a discussion about police and litigious brutality, and an opportunity to celebrate being alive and here after having been molested and beaten, and having a lot of the dynamics that I cared about change. Having my relationship with this person also.
Your daughter.
My daughter.
Signal in this place. These pigs are devils, black, they'll smoke you in this place. Pull out the camera phones and choke you out this place. They'll mimic you, then see to it that you're erased.
I wonder how much you'd want to speak to this, but I think of your show, To Serve and Protect.
I was in the midst of bearing witness to illegal stop, as far as I'm concerned, and search and frisk of a long-term friend when another officer was instructed to grab me and detain me. In his directives to do so, he chose to reach up underneath me and grab me by my genitals and attempt to slam me face forward on a police car. And I took exception to that, both verbally and physically. That turned into several other officers physically accosting me, and me ending up on the bottom of 4 police officers who were restraining me at different points of time in my body whilst beating me uninterrupted for about 5 minutes. I guess that's, how many years ago? That's 2005. So is that the thing you're referring to?
That's the thing.
Oh, yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
And then I got charged with a bunch of crimes.
Of course.
Yeah, felonies. Yeah.
I remember that there was a mural across the street. I guess technically it would be considered a mural. There was a depiction of your face.
It was a really big wheat paste.
A big wheat paste of your face from the
painting.
photo of your booking photo, I guess.
Yeah, there's an artist named No Touching Ground whose government name, I don't know if it's public record what they go by at this point in time. But yeah, that was their offering, kind of a guerrilla offering to a group show that friends and collaborators of mine had frankly twisted my arm into doing at the space that we were collectively running called Punctuation. And the show was called Serve and Protect. And it was a bit of a entendre about the slang, serve being, getting your ass kicked or your ass handed to you, and then protect being what was actually done in the subsequent criminal and civil trials that I underwent. That happened in 2010, 5 years after the actual incident. And it was a group show, and it was a bunch of people who I had collaborated with and considered friends and family. And some of my work, the only time I ever showed any work at the space, there was enough of a coalescence of interest that exhibition did get some press. And in the nature of many of the things that we did there was a large number of humans attending the opening. And then it was about half a block away from where the actual incident happened. Mm-hmm. So that probably had its own, we're talking spells, its own confidential energy to that. But that's, in a nutshell, the story. It's the short version of it.
So that obviously affected your practice in at least the sense that you made some work in response to it and amidst a show, I guess, that was speaking to that.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I did. And a bunch of people did. And it was cathartic in its way, but also very odd to be in a space full of, what I did was provide peers of mine with my various photographs from both the initial period of time. There was a Polaroid that was taken of me in the King County Jail. There was some mug shots that people had access to, a few other things, kind of collateral materials, and people made different things as a result of that. And yeah, some of the artists in question, I guess, have had some ascendancy. Both my parents were involved in the exhibition. And yes, I did also make a couple of things myself.
At this point in time, Maikoiyo knew of the CD native Ishmael Butler. As a kid, he'd seen his work on the basketball court during Ish's senior year at Garfield when they won state. He'd later know his work, of course, with Diggable Planets. However, the two barely knew each other. MAB recalls that Ish had been cool enough to check out an exhibit he'd curated at Seattle Center's Festival Sundiata, and he'd occasionally see him around, at Bauhaus Coffee or walking down 15th Avenue. However, Maikoiyo recalls one moment in particular, right after his run-in with the SPD.
When I did get beaten, and I was beaten pretty severely, like I had a C-collar on, and I looked, and I don't mean to make light of it, but I looked, more like the Elephant Man than I looked like myself. I was coming down the street on a crutch. It was like 2 days after it happened to me, maybe three, probably more like 3 or 4. But I was, conjunctiva of the eye, face all swollen. I come walking down the street, and he's sitting in the window there, and he runs outside, and he goes, "Yo, what the fuck happened to you?" And again, we knew each other more than in passing at this point in time, and I told him what happened. And he got upset, like livid, like more upset than any of my, hardcore running buddies, more upset than the cat who had been in the situation with me. Like, I had to calm him down. And I feel like for me, that was when I was like, man, this is my guy. You know what I'm saying? I fuck with this brother, man. Like, he gets it,
I never heard about that. You guys, him seeing you after.
Yeah, dude, he was livid, man. And again, like, that was oddly emboldening because it's extremely emasculating and frightening and obviously traumatizing to be beaten. Quite frankly, you know what I mean? I was beaten very severely. But to have somebody be ready to go and like run up in the police station who's, an acquaintance, but not necessarily your ace like that, was very endearing. It's been interesting watching all of us be so up in arms over traumas that we suffer as fellow Black folks of late, because I experienced something very different than that in my trauma. And I can count the number of people within the community and without outside the community who had an authentic level of empathy around what had happened to me. So I'll never forget that. But yeah, he was he was ready to go.
I can picture it.
Yeah.
We know bro's TTG.
Yeah.
But I don't really like talking violence.
Maikoiyo and Ishmael soon became friends, hanging, smoking, talking about everything under the stars.
I remember very distinctly asking him about tunes. And we would link up and he would share stuff with me, but he was really adamant about the fact that he wanted to make stuff that his name wasn't on. And he was getting a lot of pushback from people about that. And I don't know. I mean, for me, I thought it was brilliant because I was like, that's all the space in the world. I got the notion of anonymity, So I don't know what years that puts us in. That's probably like 2006, 7, So yeah, that's probably, I don't know how he remembers, but that's how, what I mean? It's It's a cool older cat who's like, oh yeah, you're cool too, young dude. I see you out here. Oh yeah, And dumb shit like, oh, I got those sneakers. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
right.
That kind of silly stuff. But again, the kind of nonverbal stuff that you're just like, oh, okay, youngins got it. And I've subsequently felt the same. That's how me and Porter started hanging out. But kind of I'm the older guy. You know what I mean? Like it's just, I think, unfortunately, amongst, and again, you can blame it on the patriarchy, whatever you want to blame it on, amongst men, there's such a lack of willingness to share information without like some weird hazing process or like putting people through the ringer of like having to prove themselves in certain ways. And we had this opportunity to be, share things like, oh, here's my father's work. Oh man, I walk past Omawali every day. You know what I mean? Like, it's just kind of there was the ability to have really interesting conversations about aesthetics and about women, about parenting, how to navigate being a co-parent as opposed to someone in a relationship with the mother of their child, different things, He granted me the benefit of his things he had learned later than perhaps he would have wanted to, that I was able to apply early, you know what I mean? And again, in some cases, vice versa, I would like to think. But I think that, you asked me earlier about Nep and Nick, or Stas and Kat, like that's what it is. That's the willingness to share. But again, he was an elder man who wasn't a sucker, who was down to share and who saw me, and also took risks on me. And I don't know what he'd say. I think that most of the risks probably panned out, you know what I mean? Yeah, a lot of it is just in like, hey man, how you doing? Or, something befalls one of us and it's an experience that the other has been through already. So we offer counsel, or it's, it's that wealth of communal knowledge that's, available real time that I think is also a factor. A bunch of sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. We're privileged to share that access to knowledge and example and emotional articulation, emotional depth. I remember back when Shabazz Palaces first came out, if you poked around their really mysterious old website, you would find this hidden piece of writing. It was excerpts from curse words by Maikoiyo Alley-Barnes. I often would come back to it and try to discern its meaning.
There's this story about a guy from here who's like from here, not like came here, was like from here.
Right.
I'm not going to get into all what that could mean, but just understand the difference between from here and came here.
Right.
Who wasn't in love with being themselves. So much so that when some people who aren't from here show up, he's enamored by their ways and wants to be like them. So he hangs out with them and eschews all of the traditions of being from here, and unwittingly becomes party to what we'll call an evil incantation that the newcomers have planned to set upon this land to destabilize it for the sake of their own we'll just call them evil plans. Not less than evil, but evil plans. So the spell in question takes mass human sacrifice. So they incur the young man who's from here to lull everyone to sleep via an elixir so that they can be anesthetized enough to have their tongues removed, as their tongues are what's part of the necessary blood price for this spell. Somewhere in the course of helping these people fall asleep, this man's ancestral energy or his conscience comes to him and says, what you're doing is not right. You need to undo what you've done. And the only way he can think to stop the newcomers from being able to remove the tongues is by burning this place to the ground. And that's, in a nutshell, the story of curse words. And perhaps maybe a story about how the Great Seattle Fire starts.
I just think about, you proffering that as a possible genesis for the Great Fire of Seattle, and just kind of thinking about those narratives, just thinking about the continuations that we live with. And I feel like a lot of times part of the paradigm we live in Seattle is continuation, just like everywhere, certainly in the United States, all across North America. It's a continuation of slaughter.
Well, I think here's the thing, right? So we do know without question that Seattle's history is like the Seattle, the company line story that you get told about Denny and Yesler coming and basically discovering this city and all these things is just erroneous. Like, it was already flourishing. It was a city that was apparently one of the largest pleasure districts in all of the world. Like Shanghai is like the only other thing that was apparently even worth mentioning. There's a bunch of different names for the district in question, but it's, it's kind of considered north of what is our downtown and in through Pioneer Square. And it was ran by women. It was supposedly devoid of a lot of the things that people often associate with sex trade in regards to violence and any number of other of the ills that kind of these patriarchal notions around the sex trade have. That had been the case for quite some time as a port. And that's obviously functioning alongside ancient indigenous dynamics and any number of other things, and doing so in a manner that is copacetic, right? Then you have the entry of these two, debatably three, white men who are actually dropped by a guide quite a few miles south of the hub of the city and led to believe that they were left in Seattle proper, but they're actually, and at the time that would not be what this, I'm not going to even butcher the name of this place or the various names that it had been called, because like most places it had numerous names. But the reality is that the people that this place is named after came along much later than this place had been functioning. And I mean, when I say later, I mean by potentially hundreds and or thousands of years in regards to even what would be, for lack of a better term, colonial interlopers, whether you're talking about French, Russian, various Asian dynamics, people of African descent who would have been consultants or traders or any number of other, terms that we might use in the now, guides. So this penchant for revision and erasure is the analogous notion that curse words references. The removal of the tongue is maybe a kind of heavy-handed reference to the disconnect and the removal of not only traditional ways, but also of languages that has been the hallmark of any number of colonial practices, particularly the ones that are indicative of how white settler violence has visited itself upon indigenous communities throughout, Turtle Island, North America, however you want to qualify this. And again, air quotes, you can't see place, but it's also very much a reference to, I guess I missed one part of that. So the important part, why it's called curse words, is that the individual who was inclined to be a self-hating or cultural hating person and who is the narrator of the story is narrating this story on the back of a number 7 bus to a little black kid. And at the point in time in question, he has attempted to kill himself more times than he can even remember at this point in time. All for naught. He's been unable to kill himself because the price of his act of betrayal is the inability to end his existence. So perhaps I forgot that part. So curse words is a reference to, one, the fact that the city also has had the gall to, although it's a very Angloized version of it, name itself after the leader of a group of people that were decimated by and large through strategic, systemic violence in its various forms. So again, it's layered. I don't know. I did meet a lot of interesting people on the back of the 7 bus.
Same.
And I'm not going to tell you that this story necessarily didn't come to me via one of those people on the back of a 7 bus. Now, can I prove one way or the other that the individual who may have relayed this, if that person was to exist, was anything other than a schizophrenic on the back of a 7 bus? No, but it's an interesting story.
Yes, it is. I feel like early on into my life living in Seattle, somebody had told me, and maybe it's erroneous, that there was this instance of that leader that the city is named for basically cursing the endeavor.
Yep.
And that is something that we're still dealing with, and all the ways that we deal with even that second city notion you talk about, and our self-image and our ability to get things going out of here is something because we're under the auspices of this curse.
I too am aware of this notion, but I think that whether that was active, or not, you can't wrought evil upon a place. I mean, and that's the other thing. So we talk about the decimation of life, and it's funny because you go to, people always revel in these rainforests and all these things here, and don't realize that half of them are actually this reforestry. That's not, because if the actual trees that were cut down were here, you'd be talking about things of the diameter of redwoods.
Right.
So what is the price of the massacre of ancients en masse? What is that? Because if you, feel free, do your Googles or go to an archive, check out how many men could stand on a stump. Mm. You can't get an I-beam that's 4 feet by 4 feet from a tree that's only, so it's I think that it's kind of lost on people that there's been decimation here. And because of, human beings' notions around our self-importance, when we think about, genocide is, just Latin-wise is references, creatures that are corporeal in a certain way and technically human beings, but the decimation of certain kinds of energy is under-acknowledged. And this place was a sacred place and is on a lot of levels still, But you can't destroy ancients without it having, high degrees of very direct and thus, ancillary and collateral damage. So, yeah, it's the price of industry, the price of supposed success. What is the blood price of that?
Next time on Fresh Off the Spaceship, we look at the work of Just Moaning.
I could really use a win right now, either in right now, so I don't wanna run anymore.
We're all connected by this understanding that we work within a realm of continuum, which I believe for us means, producing work or producing a life that is really aligned with things that we know to be true, within ourselves, within our existence. And it's our reiteration of those things.
This episode of Fresh Off the Spaceship was written, produced, and edited by Martin Douglas, Janice Headley, Dusty Henry, Isabel Khalili, and myself, Larry Mizell Jr. Audio was produced and mastered by Julian Martlew, with additional audio editing by Janice Headley. We want to thank Sub Pop Records and the members of the Constellation for giving us permission to feature their music in this episode. This episode also features music from Noel Brass Jr., Space Africa, Eve Toomer, Nyla Hunter, Laraji, and Beverly Glenn Copeland. We'd like to express our deepest gratitude to those artists, as well as their labels, Waxdomatic, Dias, Pan, Leaving, All Saints, and Transgressive/PIAS. You can find a playlist of the music we included on kexp.org. We'd also like to thank our volunteers, Elena Clark and Natalie Vinn, who helped us transcribe interviews for this episode.
Money. And we want to thank you, the listener. My name's Isabel Khalili. I'm one of the folks who's been working on this podcast, and I'm here to remind you that KEXP is listener funded. That means that the freedom we have to pursue projects like this podcast comes completely from the support of our community. And if you're here with us now, you're part of that community. So if you've enjoyed what you've heard so far and want to support the show, you can go to kexp.org/fresh. A one-time gift of $35 can make a huge difference. Or if you prefer to show your support in a different way, it would mean a lot to us if you shared this podcast with someone you think might enjoy it. And of course, leaving a rating, a review really helps other people find the podcast. So thanks again, and hope you can join us on the next episode to learn more about the artists of the Black Constellation.